And that's where we get that really nitty-gritty cardinal stuff. Again, that foundational temperance that is merely restraint from all wrong action, right?
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm Jessica Aboud, and I am here with Paul Schaefer, Tanya Charlton, and returning guest, Mr. John Christensen. John, glad to have you back.
Yep, glad to be back.
Yeah, I think the last time you were with us, you were on our Latin episode.
Which makes sense.
It does, because you are a Latin teacher here at Highlands Latin School. You are the director of our Latin curriculum. You're working on some Latin books and edits all the time.
All the time.
Yeah. Anything else you're working on right now?
What am I working on right now? I'm getting ready for Sodalitas.
Yeah.
I'm reviewing some new audio features, some audio recordings for Latin offerings, and etc.
And generally, anybody who has a Latin question that calls us,
always go to John.
Go to
and
John.
I don't want to forget, you do Classics Unraveled.
That is correct.
I cannot forget that, which is excellent.
Yep.
Yeah. And you just put out a new episode, I think?
When did we record it? When did it come out? I don't remember.
True.
It's been a while since I've been in the recording booth. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
But
I think a new one has dropped recently, and those are always just a joy to watch.
I'm excited too. I wasn't aware it dropped.
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah.
Oh, well, today we are digging into a listener question. And then, as usual, we talk about the great books. We talk about virtues, and we're coming back to one of the classical virtues that shape the soul. And that one is temperance. We've covered fortitude. We've covered piety, sacrificial love. Today, it's temperance. And I've been thinking about it a lot preparing, and it doesn't get a lot of spotlight, but it's so formative. So I'm interested to see how this is going to take shape. I don't know about you guys, but yeah. Before we get into any of that, we talk about what we're reading. Paul, been away for a few days.
I finished The Believers.
Did you like it?
I really did. And I don't want to spoil anything. I found myself, okay, no, never mind. I'm good with it. I had to think through the ending of it. I think the author tries to be fair to the Shakers, and it's from the perspective of a lady who enters the Shakers because her husband wants to enter the Shakers. And if you know the Shakers, they make men and women live apart. And she has this whole struggle with feeling that her husband's cast her off. And then she's having to decide whether she stays or not. And the ending is less than satisfying for the person that wants the ideal. But I think for the person that actually looks at the reality of the situation, you say this is the best that could happen. So I don't want to spoil anything, but I was like, I don't want to want that for that character, but I do want it for that character. And it's one of those where you just, it's a struggle. It's a struggle, but you really feel her struggle.
The Believers died off because men and women lived separately.
There are no more Shakers.
So there was really no future.
But they were not Orthodox Christians. Mother Anne was, there's something that I read there or I read about the Shakers that I felt that really put them in the non-Orthodox category. And so, but I think that was part of the contention was like a lot of the people around these Shaker villages didn't know the reality of the lifestyle they're asking them to live, but also didn't realize that their theology was so far
I don't
orthodoxy.
know a lot about their theology.
Yeah.
I'm sure I probably looked it up when I was.
Yeah.
And I've been to Shaker Village.
But I looked it up. I thought a few years ago there was only one Shaker left. Now there's 2 or 3.
Are there?
Yeah.
That's a 200% increase.
Yeah. I remember at one point they were really excited because they had a new postulant, like a new novice.
Have you been to Shaker Village?
Yeah, I've been to the one in New Hampshire. I've been to the one here. They're wonderful places.
Oh, yes. It's beautiful.
Yeah. But,
okay, so the Shaker book.
It was a very, very, very interesting. And I like Janice Holt Giles' writing. I mean, she's a good writer.
She is a good writer. You should read some more by her.
Is all her stuff Kentucky based?
Yes. or hillbilly based.
Oh, sure, sure.
How about you, Tanya?
I finished Huckleberry Finn.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've been on the road for 2 weeks.
Yep.
So I finished Huckleberry Finn and I read James by Percival Everett. And I'd never even heard of him as an author, but he's written several things. He's gotten lots of prizes. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer and he won the Booker Prize, I think. I mean, he's a really big deal in writing. It's really hard to take a book that is a classic and successfully, I think. I mean, he did a good job and it was interesting and I would have enjoyed it more if it had been an original story and not a take on Mark Twain's work. But, and I would definitely, I think he's a good enough writer that I would definitely read something else by him. But I don't know. The whole thing with Huck Finn was a little confusing to me. And the story, he followed, it paralleled through half the book, it paralleled. And then all of a sudden it went off on this other tangent so that he could, I guess, do what he wanted to do with the character of Jim. So, I don't know. But I've started Moby Dick for the conference.
You've got 2 weeks.
Different. Yeah.
Yeah, well, our upper school lit teachers took on reading Moby Dick. And we are going to go to Kyle's Wednesday workshop at the conference and listen to him tell us all about it. So far, he's not on the water yet, and it's very interesting. His characterization is good. And
yeah, you don't like those sailing books.
I don't like sailing books much. I like Sabatini.
Are you sitting down and reading this, or are you listening?
I'm
to
doing both.
Yeah,
so I've got the book, and I started it, and I read 5 or 6 chapters, just read.
Yeah.
And then Jessica Phillips recommended an audio narrator for me for it because she's reading it as well. And so I got that Audible book. So I'm just because I need to do this quickly because I have 3 weeks. I'm trying to then speed through to wherever I've read last, and then I'll go back and kind of scan the book because there are things I like to mark, and there are things that I hear that I think, oh, if I were reading that, I would be marking it, especially for a book club discussion. So that will be me for the next 3 weeks. I know Martin gets nervous that he thinks he has to have a new book every week, but I don't really think anybody expects that of us.
No.
Especially if you're reading Moby Dick.
That one.
Right. So, and we read War and Peace. I mean, I said War and Peace for 2 months.
You did.
Yeah.
I forgot that.
I also have just started the book. It finally came in,
I saw it on
Passing
my
the
desk.
Torch with Louis Marcos. So I've read the preface and the introduction to that. So I'll read that a little bit at a time alongside Moby Dick, I guess.
My turn? Yeah. I've read 2 things recently. One, in preparation for my talk for Zatalitas, I'm reading through some of our younger kids' literature, and I read through Adam of the Road over the last couple of days, and it's a marvelous little book. It runs at a pretty quick pace. It's a very solid, young boy's adventure in the middle of merry old England, and pretty much exactly the right book for the purposes of a talk that is about the open road, about the adventure of the horizon.
Oh, nice.
Right?
Yes.
And then for my on my free time, I read G.K. Chesterton's play. I did not realize he had written a play. It's just basically the one that he wrote. I think he might have written a couple of others, but this is the one that made it on stage. It was a big hit in
What's
England
the
at
name
the time.
of it?
It's called Magic.
I haven't heard of it.
It's about what's it called? A magician, like a performer magician, right? Who is invited to Duke's household to do tricks, right? But things are not as they seem, and everyone is perplexed and mystified and alarmed, even disturbed by what happens. It's
So is it like a mystery?
It's I suppose you could call it that. It's like it almost reads like a tragedy because the main characters or the conjurer's magic so confounds the witnesses, the party at this manor, that it basically drives this strong kind of almost science versus faith debate between differing viewpoints where the parish priest is, trying to reconcile it with his faith, and the kind of local doctor is trying to reconcile it with his facts and his books. And the kind of the daughter, or not the daughter, the niece is, who's already taken into kind of fairy tales and stories, is kind of prone to belief. And then her brother, the nephew, who's a skeptic, is basically driven mad by the whole thing. And they're all just trying to kind of rescue this maddened nephew's basically almost hysteria at his faith in nothing being broken. That
interesting.
They're just trying to figure out what a secret is. Like, there's got to be a trick. What's the trick?
So does this conclude, what's the word I'm going for? Satisfactorily, or like The Man Who Is Thursday just takes a weird turn at the end. And I would assume as a play, like it has to end in some satisfactory way.
It ends. It is not, it's not a happily ever after ending,
sure.
But it's an ending that satisfactorily resolves the conflict presented at the beginning. It resolves the arcs of the characters' conflicts, and it resolves the heady questions in a satisfying way. So yeah, I would say it's a perfect little capsule of a little puzzle box of questions, but all the pieces are included.
Sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Well, let's take on a listener question. We got one in the mailbox from Jennifer, and she asks, can you point me in the right direction for some talks, probably, or advice on using full curriculum sets of multiple ages at the elementary school level at the same time? And her example is she's got a preschooler, a kindergartner, and a second grader. And those grades have little to no independent work, she says. So what might a day look like for a mom teaching the box sets with those ages? Tanya, I'm going to start with you.
This is actually not too difficult because our philosophy for K-2 is that you've got to get phonics and reading done, math facts, and learn to write fluently. And so those are the only three things you really have to do. Everything else is optional and supplemental. So obviously the kindergarten student needs to do their phonics lesson and on their level because they're learning to read. And the second grader needs to do their literature guides, their spelling on their level. But those aren't that time consuming. And then math has to be on each grade level. Penmanship, you really could work on that together if you wanted to, depending on when you want to add cursive. But you could wait on cursive until the first grade if you haven't done it yet with the second grader, and just go ahead and keep working on everybody's manuscript. That's not that time consuming either. They could even use the same scripture verses for the copybook.
You could also keep them in separate levels, but like this is our copy time. Pull out everybody's going to do copy work at the same time, sort of thing.
That will require 2 lessons though, because we put the verse on the board and we talk about it. We read the Bible story connected to it, but you could do one day and one the next, and they would each just get 2 extra Bible stories, which would be great. And then everything else is tied up in enrichment. So what I would do is for the preschooler, the kindergarten, and the second grader, I would make school for the preschooler is enrichment. And because the preschooler needs to be playing anyway. And then everybody does the kindergarten enrichment. I would say not to do the second grade one, because then when the kindergartner gets to second grade, they will have already done it. So I would choose the kindergarten. And that takes...
but if the second grader, let's say if the second grader did our K-1 and she was just educating the second grader, and this is why this question's coming up, because now she's got a kindergartner coming up. If she's already done K-1 with second grader, the second grade, you could do the second grade enrichment.
But then you're...
with the kindergartner, and that would be fine.
It would be. I mean, any enrichment is fine. It doesn't matter. The books do get longer for second grade, first grade, second grade, they are getting longer and longer and bigger, but they are still read aloud books. It is the parent reading to the student. So chances are the second grader would be able to read the kindergarten books, but still it would be treated as a read aloud time. And then they would have one art lesson between them, one history lesson, one science lesson, and one piece of poetry and one piece of classical music that they're listening to together. So my guess would be that she really just needs an hour and a half probably for the first grader, the kindergartner, and about an hour and a half probably for the second grader each day independently, and the rest they can do together. But she's going to come back and ask that question when they're in third and fifth, and that's harder. That is harder.
There's a significant difference in curriculum between K-2 to third through six, but in third through six, your Latin's becoming cumulative. Your math is still separate. Your literature, like the selections, are going to be different. But you could possibly do the nature studies together, even the classical studies together, the Christian studies. You could, if they're only, if you're third and fifth grade, there is some wiggle room there, but
right now, what are you going to do when that second grader becomes a third grader and you have to start all that stuff and you've got a first grader who really needs to be working on a first grade level?
At that point, you've got to.
But at that point, you go to the forum.
I was going to say.
And you say, how do you all do this?
Yes, but also she will have a kindergartner and first grader. She can pair them up, and then the third grader would be separate.
Well, it depends on how old the preschooler is.
Oh, I just assumed it was like a junior K kind of level.
If it's junior K, if it's a 4-year-old, then you really need to do the alphabet books and the numbers book. So that even makes it a little bit more complicated for her.
Well, maybe the forum is a good place.
The forum is definitely
for her to go.
Good place.
If she has questions.
And the Facebook homeschooler group.
That's right.
Is very good as well.
MP Homeschool Families.
Memoria Press Homeschool Families.
Yeah.
Yes, that is a great thing to do as well, is to go to either or both of those places and just look and see what other people have done. But I'm not going to say it's easy. It's not easy. It's a difficult thing to do, to manage it all. But people are doing it.
That's right.
So there is hope.
Right.
And you don't have to do it all. But really in K-2, you've got to get those main things done. Because, learning to read, if you don't learn to read, you're basically done.
Well,
you've got to learn to read, and then they need to read. Yes. Yeah. Then they just need to read every day. Like in the summer, when people take the summer off, the one thing you can't take off after kindergarten is reading every day, because they will regress. And they need that. I can't think of anything bigger that we do, any other achievement as big in school as learning how to read. That is going to make such a difference in everything else they do.
Learning how to read Latin, I assume.
Yeah. Well,
I have to add something. I can't help with this conversation because when I was homeschooled, my siblings were triplets, so there were no levels to work with.
Oh, your mother was lucky and unlucky.
I was going to say, depends on where in the timeline you're talking about her. She definitely didn't enjoy step one. I think the later steps were
That's right.
Just a constant delight, I'm sure.
That's funny. Well, let's dive into today's virtue, temperance. And I didn't do any formal research on this, but I do think it's probably a word we don't use very often. And my one anecdote to prove that is when I was typing up some notes, Microsoft kept correcting temperance, which I was spelling correctly, to temperature. It didn't even know the word. So I don't think we talk about it very much. Paul, would you kick us off with a definition? And John and Tanya can chime in, but we'll just...
I want to use another word that we don't use much to define temperance, which would be the habit that restrains concupiscence.
Paul! Microsoft would definitely not like that.
The sort of the human passions that lead us towards sensuality, comfort, selfishness, that kind of stuff is what temperance moderates. So temperance would moderate your gluttony, your sloth, your lust, your all those sorts of things is where the temperance is the habit that restrains all of that.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like the dial that, dials you back, or I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. But I also think we probably need to include like some sort of, it's dialing you back, but there's probably a little bit of shoving that it does too.
So it's action too.
So again, in its most kind of common usage in English, it definitely has this sort of specific relationship to kind of the appetitive inclination, the appetites of people. The same way that courage, for example, has a sort of association with military valor or something like that. If we're looking at it in its kind of classical definition, its formal philosophic definition, I like to explain the 4 cardinal virtues, which temperance is one of, right? When you were describing some of the other virtues you've talked about before, like sacrifice. Sacrifice isn't one of the cardinal Greek virtues necessarily, but courage is, or prudence is. And so I try to kind of describe it as a quadrant where prudence is knowing what must be done, right? Basically, the knowledge and the wherewithal to determine the right course of action. Justice is merely doing so correctly with respect to others, right? Courage and temperance are kind of opposites. Courage is the right inclination to do what one must in pretty much any context, military or otherwise. Temperance is the inclination to not do what you mustn't, whether appetitive or otherwise. It is, you could say, not just pure restraint, but merely restraint against the wrong, right? So certainly, again, as we typically use it, it has this strong, just sort of linguistic or social connection with with appetitive restraint, but it's specifically a restraint from an excess, right? Again, in Greek philosophy, virtue is all about a golden mean, right? And Aristotle describes temperance as simply holding to that mean from excess, as opposed to holding to that mean from a deficit, which would be courage or fortitude.
Okay. I was just going to say self-restraint.
That's right.
John, is there an intentional difference between the classical and Christian understanding of this virtue?
Absolutely, there is. I was hoping someone would ask. So you could kind of split it 2 different ways. I think the simplest way would say, are we talking about temperance as one of the cardinal virtues? Are we talking about temperance as one of the heavenly virtues? Are you familiar with the distinction?
No, that's what he's asking.
Okay, yeah. So in everyone on the planet has heard of the 7 deadly sins, right?
I don't know that everybody on the planet has, but keep going.
Everyone on planet Earth and in low Earth orbit has heard of the 7 deadly sins, right? Gluttony and pride and lust and all those things, right? The formal definition of their opposites not formal, the cultural definition of their opposites, they're not formally codified in like any particular church council or something like that, would be the 7 heavenly virtues. So for something like gluttony, that would be temperance. Again, a direct response to a specific appetitive bodily desire, right? Whereas the act of restraint from any of the other given sins, like pride, would not have that title, right? It would have something like meekness or humility for pride, right? Or contentment for envy, right? But
what are you're giving opposites? I'm confused.
Okay.
Yeah.
These are the definitions. I'm pulling these out of Dante just because that's where I've read them most recently. But the heavenly virtues as defined, for example, in Dante's Purgatorio, temperance is defined merely as the opposite to gluttony.
Oh, the opposite to gluttony.
The opposite. The you could say opposing virtue to the vice.
I missed the opposing part.
My apologies. So again, temperance as a word defining virtue has these kind of 2 jobs. In the classical tradition, as this almost, cardinal, this directional definition of right action away from excess. But in the Christian tradition, the word is used in a sort of different context. Again, the opposing virtue to the vice of appetite, of gluttony.
Only gluttony.
Again, just in terms of the traditional use of the word, yes.
But I haven't fully read Dante, so I don't know how he does it, but the way I'm used to thinking about it is, you've got the 7 deadly sins, so don't necessarily correlate to the 7 virtues made up of the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and the 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice.
So that's a common mistake, is they think, people think, oh, well, you have the 7 virtues, which again, in the classical tradition and in the early Christian tradition would be the 4 Greek virtues, the cardinal virtues, which again can be described as pagan virtues of a sort, not because they're pagan, but because they're human virtues. Yeah. They're available to anyone because they simply describe human excellences, right? Again, if I can be excessive in some area of human activity or in deficit in some human activity, then I should be able to be in the middle of that human activity. Whereas the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, are supernatural excellences, right? Again, faith in something, hope in something, love of something is only finitely good unless it's a love of, a hope in, a faith in the infinite, right? And so the heavenly virtues, the theological virtues and the cardinal virtues, the kind of big 7 of kind of foundational Christianity, are not the same kind of virtues as each other, because you've got those human ones and those divine ones. But then the heavenly virtues are not the same thing. They're a different set of virtues.
There's different categorization of the virtues.
You could say that the word virtue here is being used loosely and kind of to describe different excellences, the same way that you might say the Greeks use the word God differently than we do, because they used it to refer to a whole slew of different supernatural entities of varying power, whereas we use it for a single supreme.
Okay.
Right?
But what you're trying to say is, from the sort of a Dante perspective of the heavenly virtues, the temperance there is not a moderation, but is the opposite of gluttony.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that largely arises, again, and I think the reason the word made that kind of bridge from the more kind of patristic, early, very Greek scholarship on early Christianity to the more medieval, earthy, we've got our little 7 deadlies, vices and our 7 heavenly virtues, is because, especially in the kind of mid and late classical period of Christianity, one of the most obvious and most visible and kind of most celebrated articulations of classical temperance was physical austerity, right? Where think of the early monastics, right? A lifestyle that's defined almost not exclusively, but certainly most visibly by temperance, right? Abstention, restraint from worldly goods, right? Now, the reason why that kind of became a different thing, I think, is because the abstinence of a monk, right? Especially those extreme examples of like Simeon the Stylite, the fellow who lived on top of a pillar so that he couldn't dwell with humankind, is a sort of supernatural austerity, right? A supernatural temperance.
Again, it's way beyond any form of moderation.
It's not the golden mean, right?
Yeah.
Where you could say that the cardinal virtues, which in classical pagan terms, and here I mean it literally pagan, in Greek terms, meant merely finding the right measure of something in a terrestrial context. Those things kind of get warped or kind of changed. The dimensions change as soon as we are called to be perfect because your Lord is perfect, right? Again, think of courage or fortitude, right? By Greek standards, martyrdom is not a golden mean of anything, right? It's an extreme. It's an excess, you could say, in fortitude. And yet in a Christian context, suddenly that kind of moving of the dial towards an excess in courage, you could say even a rashness in courage as a form of witness, becomes something that is, you could say, fails to abide by a cardinal virtue, but thereby transcends it and becomes more theological, right? And so I think the temperance as it's defined in the heavenly tradition, and again, the kind of medieval cultural tradition, such as in Dante, is more reflecting on that sort of ascetic form of temperance. Does that make sense?
Does to me.
Sure. And it seems like, though, to get back to the virtues as a whole, the rightly, to order them rightly means they're interdependent on one another.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of shining through in what you're saying. Temperance is it's part of a rightly ordered life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say the cardinal virtues especially can be thought of almost as like the neutrons and protons and
Sure.
electrons that make
Sure.
the atoms, but atoms come in different flavors, right?
Yeah.
So again, all the individual kind of more particular things that we describe virtues, like self-sacrifice or fear of the Lord or something like that, right, can be thought of as the atoms, these very distinctly characteristic right actions, right? But those are all made up of, in terms of what are we experiencing spiritually or morally when we're engaging in them, are made up of these really mechanical operations of like, what do I do? What do I not do? Right? What judgment do I make and how do I follow through on it? And that's where we get that really nitty-gritty cardinal stuff. Again, that foundational temperance that is merely restraint from all wrong action, right? As opposed to this more this specific, like restraint from alcohol in the sense of temperance, right? That kind of thing.
Well, let's bring in some books, and we always love to do this. This is for everybody. Where do we see temperance at work in, whether it's the books that come to the top of your mind or the books in our reading list for children? Do you have some examples?
I think now I'm wondering, are my examples right? But I think that the one that comes to mind immediately for me is the Lord of the Rings. Everybody wanting that ring and not being able to give it up. Not having the strength or the fortitude to give it up.
Right. That's a perfect example, I think.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
But there's a maybe one would say that the desire that they have for the ring, like temperance should cut that off.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So that they could control it.
Right. But then once they have the ring, and in some ways it would be fortitude that would let go of that.
Right.
I suppose so.
Yeah.
You could say that, again, if the ring is power, right? If the ring represents the sort of absolute kind of power of the will and the ability to impose one's will upon the world, right?
Okay, you're looking at this from the symbolic view. Okay, all right.
Sure, but
Keep
even
going.
in the very literal,
I was thinking of the physical ring.
even if we're talking physically, right? If it's ability, if it is the ring of power, if it is that by which Sauron can impose his will upon the other rings, for example, then, or whenever we hear it described in terms of the effect it has or may have on those who touch it or desire it, it always comes down to, I could use it for good, but I wouldn't, right? Think of how Gandalf describes it when he's tempted by the ring, that I would wish to use it for good, but through me, it would do terrible things, right? That it has such an overwhelming force of yes, it is impossible to say no to it, right? It's a challenge to temperance and essentially an insurmountable challenge to temperance for some. What makes Frodo distinct and unique and worthy to carry the ring is that he is capable of saying no to the ring's impulse. Spoiler alert, up until the very end.
Right.
But Sam is able to.
Sam is.
Yeah.
Sam really is.
Sam is temperance incarnate. He's fortitude incarnate because he was able to bring the thing, the final step of the way.
Yeah,
He's like an archetypal hero.
But is Sam temperance incarnate? I mean, he has like first breakfast, second breakfast, first lunch, second lunch.
But again,
Is he a glutton?
well, you could say, but it's his nature, right? Again, it's the Hobbit's nature to have so many breakfasts.
That is true.
Right?
Yes.
Tolkien definitely is not one of these, is not an ascetic in his attitudes about food.
No.
Right. As he sees it, the enjoyment of good food and good ale is a fundamental component of the Hobbit life.
Right. But that gets to temperance as moderation of that. It is fine to enjoy those good things, right?
Yeah.
And temperance lets us know at what point do you go past that.
Yeah. And especially think of how the sort of character that food takes on in Lord of the Rings, right? Where it's either mere sustenance, it's lembas, keeping them going on the way, or it's kind of kinship and hominess and fraternity, right? This sort of beckoning to a table, beckoning to a community, right? Food and meals and banquets and feasts obviously have this sort of ancient tradition of being something more than mere subsistence, right? Or sustenance, rather. This sort of, catalyst for communion, right? For community that I think is entirely the reason Tolkien made food such a big deal with the hobbits, that it was, they were a very homey people, a very community-oriented people, and that always seemed to kind of be coaxed together around the promise of, of food, or the, the green dragon, or the inn, or pipeweed, or some kind of consumption, right? Whereas, should something like that's never described in a form that leads to some kind of excess, with perhaps the sole exception of what's his name, Bomber in The Hobbit, right? Who's described as the fat one, right?
Oh, I remember him.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, again, which his overindulgence in food leads him into some physical plights now and then, because he's not especially adroit of foot.
Oh,
right.
like Winnie the Pooh when he gets stuck in Rabbit's house.
He gets stuck a lot.
That's a perfect example of, again, well, that's definitely that appetitive temperance being shown in deficit in this case, where there's a direct consequence to his indulgence, where it's not merely,
Which I feel like most of our children's books, that's what they're doing, is I think the story about Ping, Peter Rabbit, Wilbur in Charlotte's Web, Edmund in Lion with the Witch and the Wardrobe, Peter in Heidi. It's all misbehavior as students or children or animals are having to learn that self-restraint. And so, but we don't call it temperance when we're teaching them.
Right.
We just are pointing out, that these characters wouldn't be in trouble if they behaved, if they did show some kind of moderation in their behavior. Ping just goes off and he suffers for it. They all suffer for it. But, all the way through, Anna Karenina suffers for it, for her lack of
denying her concupiscence.
Yeah. Yes. Of course.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. Some of the examples, especially the younger examples you bring up. Again, I was making this big distinction between the kind of distinctly appetitive, kind of medieval, heavenly virtue treatment of temperance and the more cardinal, kind of mechanical, thou shalt not component of temperance. But it is interesting that for Peter Rabbit, for example, sure, on the surface, again, as sort of an easy fable, the thing that he does wrong is that he's eaten the carrots and the celery he's eating, right? It's that appetitive version. But that's really just sort of an easy to comprehend upper layer of his real problem, which is defiance of a boundary given to him, right?
That's right.
That he's given
he
a parental...
was not supposed to be in that garden.
Right, yeah, he was told not to. He disobeyed that order. And so his intemperance is actually multi-layered, right? It's a form of a lack of restraint of various impulses on his part,
That's
various
right.
vicious impulses, of which the hungry part is merely you could say the didactic lesson for the young child reading it. But by seeing the direct consequences of his failure to check his appetitive impulse, we also see the consequences for his failure to check his defiant impulse, his individualistic impulse, his his heedlessness of danger, and so forth.
Who knew Peter Rabbit could be so complicated?
I know.
But I was able to find a few, think about a few books that do have a positive, not just modifying behavior, but especially, and this book is so sad, I even hated revisiting it, but Joe in Lassie has to learn to tell Lassie, don't come home anymore, because she's been sold, and it's the wrong thing for him to keep bringing her back and letting her come back. And at first, he really fought it. And then finally, you just see him recognize that he has been sold. And it was not because his parents wanted to get rid of Lassie, but it was because of a family situation. They didn't have the money to take care of her. And so he shows great restraint there, because he wants this dog more than anything in his life. He loves this dog, and he has to walk away from her.
Well, in some ways, right, that's a rejection of greed, right? Like, because it's something that he wants.
Very badly.
And I was thinking also of like Robin Hood,
yes,
where actually the whole story, the whole reason Robin Hood exists is because of the greed of the sheriff.
Yes.
Right.
And Prince John.
And Prince John. Right. But that if they had the temperance to restrain themselves,
then Robin Hood wouldn't exist.
He wouldn't exist.
There would be no need for him. But I was going to contrast Robin Hood and Maid Marian to Lancelot and Guinevere, which we read in the same year.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Maid Marian goes to the forest to live with Robin Hood, she says, I will live in honor. She tells her father, I will live in honor in the forest until King Richard comes back to marry us. And then the next book we read is King Arthur, where Lancelot and Guinevere make a totally different decision. And I think that contrast for students is very good. And it is their first time of dealing with, with an adult theme, like, well, except for David and Bathsheba, we've already taught that.
Right. Yeah.
By the time they read
I like
this.
the component you talked about in Lassie Come Home, in that it's not so much distinctly about temperance itself, but about teaching virtue in general, which is the idea that on one hand, a child reading the book is going to be very sympathetic with the child, right?
Yes.
Wanting his dog back. That's a fundamentally normal and healthy thing to want, right? And yet the circumstances are such that it is right for him to abstain from that pursuit, right? And that's not just a very valuable lesson to children, it's a very difficult lesson to live out as an adult, which is that, again, the idea that evil circumstances do not justify vicious actions, right?
Right.
That, for example, if it was unjust that if the circumstances under which my dog is sold are dubious, that does not authorize me or legitimize me just taking it back, right? Which is, it's so easy to say, well, the circumstances justify it, right? That's such an easy trap to fall into.
Which actually Robin Hood makes that decision, right?
In what sense? I see what you mean. Yeah. Oh, well, okay.
But here's the thing is, and because I've brought that up in talks before, and I've had people come up and tell me, because I was like, you have to ask the question: Is it right for Robin Hood to steal from the rich? He's stealing from the rich in order to give to the poor, but like he's making a bad choice. And I've had people come up to me and say, well, in fact, what he's doing is fighting against tyranny, which is an act of justice. And so it's very complicated. It's complicated. And that's where getting these students having these conversations, you start to realize not that everything is relative, that it all depends on your point of view, but that life is complicated.
And also that there's a difference between, like if one is stolen from, there's a difference between stealing it back from the thief and stealing from someone else to make up for it, right? Yes. So again, like the tyranny against which Robin Hood is fighting is quite different than the I don't remember if it's a lord or a baron, the fellow who takes the dog in Lassie Come Home, not in Robin Hood.
Oh no, they literally sell Lassie.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's fair play, right?
Yeah,
like the circumstances of Lassie's departure is not an act of tyranny, right?
Oh, right.
And so you could say the it's a different game, right?
It is. Yeah. Because in reality, he does own Lassie.
Right. Yeah.
And so she belongs to him.
Yeah, and in Robin Hood, there is a recognition of proper authority because King Richard is the proper authority.
Yes.
And they're fighting against the improper authority.
Yeah. No, there's an important difference between that. There's an important difference between, for example, if there's some question of getting the dog back, is it the child's job to manage this, or is it the dad's job to manage this? The fact that one of these protagonists we're talking about is an adult and is a child does bear in the matter, where a fairly salutary component of a lot of these books we read in our younger classes is that there is a sort of I guess totem pole of offices, of responsibilities that there's something worthwhile for a child to know. Maybe this is something for my dad or mom to take care of, right? Not as
But the dad does take care of it in an underhanded way after he's preached honesty through the entire book.
I don't remember that part.
He, should I give a spoiler?
I'm going to have to go read Lassie. I mean, I think it's fine, but I mean, I'm going to have to go read this now.
He disguises her so that they don't, it's an interesting dilemma for a fourth grader, fifth grader.
So why are we teaching this book? No.
It all is fine in the end, but you do have to ask that question.
Yeah.
Was that right? That he basically tricked his way to getting Lassie back for his child?
I do not know. But what I was going to say with this whole Lassie thing was that there is something to be said about not just the not justifying vice because of circumstance, but that virtue in and of itself is its own reward, right? Virtue is self-evidently good.
Yes.
And I think in a situation like Lassie Come Home, and stories like it, that becomes really apparent, where you can look at this child and say, well, I want him to get his dog back, right? And I can twist the circumstances in my head in such and such a way where I can think that he deserves to get the dog back, right? But even his act of restraint is admirable, right? Where you cannot help but think this is a good kid because he is choosing, despite a wrong, right, to simply accept, right? There's something to be said about how Temperance evinces in a clearly narrative way who the good guys are, right? I was reading the last time I was in a podcast, I mentioned reading something else by G.K. Chesterton, and he talks about the Adam and Eve narrative in a very thematic way, which of course is quite literally an act of temperance in both the appetitive and the cardinal sense, right? And he says, it's quite one thing for Adam to say, I take the apple because I'm hungry, right? Or I take the apple because I'm curious, or I take the apple because I was tricked or whatever, right? That means merely that he is, intemperate in a sort of, I guess, in a
less defiant way.
In a less defiant way. But it's another thing if Adam should take the apple and say, I take the apple because boundaries are meant to be crossed and man's will is the furthest reach of his frontier. He said, here he ceases merely to be a glutton, but he becomes a cad, right? He becomes not just a man lacking virtue, but a man possessed by vice, right? By a character inclined towards vice, right? And so it kind of sounds weird to say Lassie Come Home is kind of the foil to that, but it is, right? That a sort of a direct, you could say almost unwarranted stance of I'll take what I want, right? I'll do what I can, darn the consequences, is the sort of moral opposite of saying I will choose to do the temperate thing, the restraining thing, kind of darn the consequences merely because that's the right thing to do, right? I think that's a valuable lesson in of itself.
Have you thought about Jane Eyre?
She reminds me more of Fortitude, but she absolutely is. I mean, that scene that I talked about was a Temperance as well.
So when we talked about Fortitude, we talked about her courage to turn her back on the person that she loved most in the world because it was morally wrong to be with him. Is that also temperance?
Yes.
I would absolutely think so.
How are they different?
Go ahead.
I don't know that they have to be different to both be acting together.
I think by a classical definition, actually, I'll just say a Dante definition because I'm in Dante mode right now. Aristotle, and by extension, Dante's Virgil, defines love as a drawing towards the beloved, right? As an inclination towards a thing. And so a choosing not to draw towards the beloved would be an act of restraint. It would be an act of temperance more than an act of drawing towards, of acting, of fortitude, right?
Yeah.
But I think in some ways you're saying like temperance is going to be saying no to a bad thing and fortitude is going to be saying yes to a good thing, right? Going after that thing.
Which is both.
Which-
She did
so
both.
in
just
some ways
holding
it's-
firm with the
right.
good.
Yes.
But in some ways, it's two
So she
sides of the
said
same
no
coin.
to bigamy, but but in saying no to bigamy, she was saying yes to her faith,
Integrity.
and her moral.
So I think they can
Integrity,
be,
yes, yes.
you know, two pedals on a bike
Mhm.
that propel her towards the right thing.
Yeah.
Well, they can be, you
Yes,
know?
yes.
Yeah. Again, when
Yeah.
I try to chart it out for my students, I describe it as, again, like quadrants. And fortitude and temperance are the opposing quadrants, right? Doing what one must, not doing what one mustn't, right?
Right.
I think that's helpful.
And every time you say yes, you're saying no to something else.
Absolutely.
That's called opportunity cost.
And we teach them that from the beginning of, you know,
Mhm.
the literature books. And that might be a good note to end on is how do we teach this? Well, it's modeled in the books we read.
It
And
is.
that's how we teach so many things to
Yes.
children.
Yeah.
Is they
Literature.
see it in a story.
Yes.
Right.
And,
And-
history.
And
That's right.
really understanding causes and consequences, right?
Yeah.
Like when you really understand this action is going to bring this other action, then the virtuous action, it's a reward in and of itself, like John says, but it also makes more sense, right? And for kids, because with kids, every occurrence is just a miracle, right? there is no cause here, there is no consequence.
That's right.
But as they see that in story again and again and again, that starts to sink in of this kind of action will have this kind of consequence.
Mhm.
And then they can internalize that and live that out.
That's right. That's right. Mm. And that's why our stories are so important too. I know in the beginning, we talked about enrichment, which the enrichment sets are so full of books
Yes.
and they are optional, but man, do they add value.
they do. They do.
Yeah.
It's really important to read to your child.
I know. And talk through these things as you're reading, you know, how we just
Yes.
sit with them. We ask
That's
questions.
right.
What do you think? Why did he do that? What happened?
Yeah. And
You know?
reference back to those stories when
That's
you're like,
right.
you're being like, so-and-so in this story.
Remember when
right?
Peter Rabbit ate the carrot? Yeah. Oh, that's good. Well, temperance. We did it. And hopefully Microsoft Word will catch on from now on and get the word right. Oh, John, I'm glad you joined us. So that quadrant was really helpful for me. I'm going to take that with me.
Do it.
That was helpful.
Yep.
Yeah, and thank you, Tanya and Paul, for being with us again. Yeah. And thank you for joining us. We'll be back next time. Thanks for joining us today on Classical Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.